Welcome. My name is Terry Soul, and this is Programming Chaos, a channel devoted to fun and interesting programming projects to help you hone your programming skills. In today's video, I'm going to be introducing the concept of classes and objects. And because Halloween is coming up when I'm recording the video, I'm going to do it in the context of procedurally generating a whole variety of pumpkins, with the idea that if you want, you can add some eyes and a mouth to turn them into jack-o'-lanterns. So to understand classes and objects, and in fact to understand any programming concept, it's important to understand the problem that it's trying to solve. So when there is a feature added to a language or some new programming concept is developed, it's specifically to solve a particular problem. By understanding the problem, you gain a greater understanding of the solution. And so in today's video, I'm actually, in a sense, going to start by programming things the wrong way, and then I'm going to introduce classes and objects to fix the problem so that we can program it the right way and thereby see how they get applied. If you're not familiar with it, the environment that I'm programming in is processing using the Java language, but arguably that doesn't matter much. The idea of classes and objects is common through pretty much all modern programming languages, and so the ideas that I'll talk about here apply in pretty much any language you might be using. To begin with, what I want to do is write a function to draw my pumpkins, and maybe not immediately obvious, but I'm drawing the pumpkins by drawing a little green stem and then 3 ellipses, and then actually a 4th ellipse in the middle to erase some of these lines. So I just need to create a function to do that. And I'm going to pass into that function the XY location where I want the pumpkin drawn. And I'm going to use a translate to translate to that location and then draw the pumpkin. So in processing, we use a push matrix and a pop matrix. That matrix is our current coordinate system. And what I'm really doing is translating the coordinate system to this new location, and then I can start drawing my pumpkin. The first thing I want to do is draw just the green rectangle for the stem. So I need to pick my color by using a fill command and then draw a rectangle. And in terms of the color, this is actually not meant to be red, green, blue. This is hue, saturation, and brightness. So I need to go to my setup, which is run at the beginning of the code, and change my color mode. So this sets the color mode to be hue, saturation, brightness, where the hue is 360 degrees like a color wheel, and then saturation and brightness range from 0 to 100. So this gives me a green, very saturated but slightly dark rectangle for the stem. And these are just some numbers. It basically shifts it up and a little to the left so it's centered nicely above the pumpkin. And now I can start drawing those ellipses. So this draws an ellipse on the left, that's the -25, an ellipse on the right, that's the +25, and a slightly larger ellipse, 50 by 50 in the center. And these are actually going to end up being circles, and then I'll use scaling to scale it to look more like a pumpkin. But this should work okay. All I need to do is call the function and pass in the correct location. So width is the width of the window, which is created by my size function. So 800 times 0.5, 400, that's the middle of the window. And the same thing, that's the middle for the height of the window. And if I run this, there I have a pumpkin-like object. Again, I'm doing it with circles, so I might want to rescale it, which I'll do in a minute. And I haven't drawn the center ellipse to erase some of these lines, which will also make it look a little more pumpkin-like. And because, as I said, Halloween is coming up, I might want to fill in the background in black. But that's a good start for a pumpkin anyway. So I'll do the background in black. And then I need my next ellipse sort of sideways in the middle to erase a couple of those lines. And I need to make sure that I'm not drawing an outline. So that's a no stroke command. So this ellipse is also drawn at the center where I've shifted my coordinate system to, and 90 is fairly wide and 30 is not as high, so it erases that bit in the middle. I do want the stroke around the other ellipses, so I'd better remember to fill those in. Put the stroke back in here. So my first 3 ellipses have black outlines, and then my 4th one erases a bit of it. And there we go, not a bad looking pumpkin. Again, I'd like to rescale it maybe to make it a little narrower and a little taller. I'll do that in a minute. But what I'd really like, as I had on my background, is a whole bunch of these pumpkins sort of filling the screen. And so in my draw function, instead of drawing one pumpkin, I'm going to put in some for loops to draw a whole bunch of them. So let's go ahead and do that. And this may look a little odd, but the idea is I want to start 1/9 of the height down. So that starts a little down the screen. And then I'm going to keep going, in a sense, till I get to the maximum height. So I can just simplify this and make it just the height. And each time I'm going to move down 1/9 of the height. And so that will give me a nice division between them moving down the screen. And then I want to do the same thing moving across. And here I'm only dividing by 5 because I want fewer pumpkins going across. And let me indent just to make things look nice. And then when I call my draw pumpkin, I'm going to use those XY coordinates. So there we go. There's a whole bunch of pumpkins. I guess the last couple are cut off, but that's okay. I won't worry about it for now. But these are all the same. And what I really want is to procedurally generate them so they're all a little bit different. And as I said, the way that I'm going to do that, at least to begin with, not worrying about the eyes or the mouth yet, just the overall shape and the color, I'm going to use scaling factors to change the size and the X and the Y scale. And I'm also going to put in a little bit of randomness in the fill color. So let's go ahead and do that. What I want is those variables for the scale first. And I might as well set the values right away. So for the overall scale, I think I want my pumpkins maybe to be a little bit bigger. So random from 1 to 1.7. For the X scale, they're a little too wide, so I want them not as wide. So I'm going to do that as 0.5 to 1.0. So they'll tend to be narrower in scale. And I want them a little taller. So you can play with these numbers if you want in order to sort of get different scaling factors there. So all I have to do now is, after I do my translation, I can set those scales. So there is a overall scale function, which I just use the scale variable for. And then I can also call the scale function with a separate X and Y value. And let's see, totally misspelled random. So we can fix that. That's going to rescale the pumpkin overall with this first command, and then also adjust the X and Y scales separately. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, I don't think that's going to work right, you're absolutely correct. That's what I meant about doing this wrong the first time around. I'm also going to play with the hue a little bit as long as I'm here. And you'll notice that I was filling in with 30 because that gives us this nice sort of yellow-orange color. And I just want random numbers a little bit around that. So I think I'll go from 15 to 45. And then I'm going to make that the hue down here. So let's see how that looks. Well, there's the problem. I'm getting random pumpkins, but every time I go through the draw loop, because the draw loop loops about 60 times a second, each of those pumpkins is being re-randomized, which is probably not what we want. And I'm going to stop it before it gives me a headache. What I want is to generate these random numbers once and then use them every time I draw that pumpkin. So one way to do this would be to create an array that has all of my scale values, and then a separate array and fill it in with all of the X scale values, and a separate array for the Y scale values, and a separate array for all of the hues. But now I've got to juggle 4 arrays, and if I want to draw, for example, pumpkin number 1, I've got to remember to go into each array and grab the right values for that pumpkin. And that is clumsy because I've got a whole bunch of arrays, and it's prone to errors if I forget to go and grab one of those values, or if I somehow get my values wrong. So I could be trying to draw pumpkin number 7, but forget to update the hue and draw it with the hue of pumpkin number 6. So that notion of bunches of separate arrays doesn't really work well. What I would like to do is take all of this data and lump it together in one object. And that's the idea, is to be able to say a pumpkin is an object, and each pumpkin object knows its own scale and its own hue. And so to do that, we create a class which defines what an object should look like. So let's go ahead and do that now. In processing, it's nicest to do it by creating a new tab, and I will just call this pumpkin. And then I'm going to create my class pumpkin. And the idea is this defines what data and also what functions go into a pumpkin object. And so I know right away that I want it to have these variables. So I can just cut and paste those over. I don't want to randomly generate them here. I'm actually going to randomly generate them as part of the constructor. So a constructor, if you're not familiar with it, is a specialized function that creates new pumpkins. So let me, as long as I'm here, sort of do both at once. So the way this works is the constructor has the same name as the class itself. So the class is a pumpkin. This constructs a new pumpkin for me. And what I really want to do is take the random part and put that into the constructor. And then here, I'm just reserving the variable. So I'm saying pumpkins have a scale variable. And when I create a new pumpkin, that's when I give it a random value. And I'll do the same thing for each of these. And I didn't copy and paste the hue over. I should have done that, but that's okay. So notice sort of the similarity between the function that I had before, which was drawing a pumpkin and generating these random values to procedurally generate different pumpkins as I went, and this new version where I'm going to say take all of those variables and lump them together in an object. And I define the object by defining what the class is. And then in my constructor, I construct them by setting those values. And I think that I also want each pumpkin to know its XY location. And if I want, I can put it as a list like this. But in order to arrange them nicely in the window, I'm going to have to pass that in as an argument. So my constructor will get the XY value as an argument. And I'm going to call this new X and new Y. And then down here, I'll say X equals that new X. Y equals that new Y. So all of the data associated with a pumpkin is part of an object because it's defined that way in the class. And when I construct a new pumpkin, I tell it where it should be located. Now, the next thing that pumpkins need to be able to do is to draw themselves. And so I'm going to take a bunch of the code from my draw pumpkin and put it here in a draw function. So a new function, draw pumpkin. Let me scroll up a bit. And I don't have to pass the XY value in because the pumpkin already knows its XY location because I told it when I created that pumpkin. So now I can go back to my sketch and in fact just grab all of this code and paste it into my draw pumpkin. And the big difference is the XY location is already known by the pumpkin. The pumpkin knows its own scale. It knows its XY scale. So it has all of that information as part of the object. So an object has a bunch of data members that are part of it, and also some functions, like a function that allows it to draw itself, and a function that allows it to construct itself. So we've got our class. Now we need to go in and create some pumpkin objects. And the way I'm going to do that is by creating an array list of pumpkins. And instead of needing a whole bunch of array lists for all of those different variables, I'm just going to create one array list of pumpkins, but each pumpkin stores all of the variables that it needs. So let me do the code and it'll become a little more clear. So there's my array list of pumpkins, and if we have a list of pumpkins, I guess that has to be called a patch, right? So there we go. Now I've got a pumpkin patch. And so there I'm going to create the actual array list. So this defines it, but this creates it in memory. And then I need to add all of my pumpkins to that list. And the way that I'm going to do that is actually very similar to what I have in the draw loop. So I'm going to copy this over. But here, instead of drawing pumpkins, I'm going to take my patch and add to it a pumpkin at that location. So notice the similarity between the two pieces of code. Here I was looking at the XY positions and drawing pumpkins there. Here I'm taking the XY positions, but using them as part of the constructor. And I have an error, and that's because I forgot to say it. Those need to be new pumpkins. So now things get quite a bit simpler. I don't need these for loops anymore because each pumpkin already knows the location that it should draw itself. So I'm just going to comment all of that out. And instead, I'm going to go through my array and ask each pumpkin to draw itself. So the idea here is for each pumpkin P in the patch, I just ask P to draw pumpkin. So go through all of the pumpkins in my patch and ask them to draw it themselves. So now I get random variation of pumpkins, but even though I'm going through the draw loop and drawing them over and over again, the pumpkins themselves aren't changing after I've constructed them. And notice that my main code is fairly simple, right? I'm just creating an array, going through and creating a bunch of pumpkins and telling them their locations, and then going through and drawing them. And this is one of the big advantages to defining classes and using them as objects. You can have on a big team, one part of the team writing the class, and then somebody else can just use that class without worrying about the details. I don't need to know everything that goes into pumpkins. I just know how to create them and how to draw them. So that's the basic idea, and it solves that problem of how do we keep track of what each pumpkin should look like? Well, we take all of that data and lump it together in one object, and so each pumpkin object knows all about itself. Now, if we want to take these from being pumpkins and turn them into jack-o'-lanterns, all we have to do is go into the draw pumpkin routine and add, say, fill in some little triangles for the eyes or some arcs for the mouth. If we want to add some variation, then we might need some more parameters. So if we look at my pumpkins, for example, my jack-o'-lanterns, not all of the eyes look the same, and that's because they're being rotated. So I added another data member to my class, eye angle, which tells me how much to rotate the eyes. I didn't do it in this example, but we could add, another variable, mouth scale, which would scale the mouths. For procedural generation, what we're doing is saying, well, anything that I want to vary, the hue or the rotation of the eyes or the size of the mouth, I add another variable to my class and then initialize it randomly. And every time I go in to draw one of those objects, it uses its own variables to know exactly how to draw itself. So that's the idea behind classes and objects. At least the fundamental idea is it allows us to define an object that might have lots of variables associated with it. And it is perfect for procedural generation because it allows me to create lots of variations of pumpkins because each pumpkin has its own data that I can, for example, randomize. So hopefully that makes the idea behind classes and objects a little clearer and a little easier to understand. And again, this is a really important concept. When you're dealing with a new feature of a language or a new programming concept, in many cases, the best way to understand it is to understand what problem it's trying to solve. Because if you know what problem it's trying to solve, then you understand how to apply it. Okay? Love to hear comments. If you create some interesting jack-o'-lanterns of your own, I'd love to see links and check them out. And happy programming. Thank you. And for those of you who wanted to stick around, I'll show you how I did the eyes and the mouth. So we already have two parameters, one for how we want to rotate the eyes and the other for scaling the mouth. But I do need to give those initial values. I could do it here by setting this equal to some random range, but it's much better program design to do it as part of the constructor. So that's what I'm going to do. So there's the random eye angle. And then for the mouth, I'm going to do a range between 0.3 and 1.0. So the mouths I have here already pretty much fill the whole pumpkin. So I only want random mouths that are a little smaller than that. So that gives me my initial values. And now I just have to add them to the draw pumpkin function. And in order to make my code a little more readable, I'm going to do them as separate functions that are just called from within this function. So there's my draw eyes function. And again, the idea is I don't want to add a whole bunch more code to the draw pumpkin function because it's getting pretty long. So I'll break it out as a separate function. And the eyes are going to be black, so I can fill with 0. And then I want to rotate them. So I need to do another push matrix and actually translate my coordinates to the point at which I want to rotate the eyes. Currently, the origin of my coordinate system is at the center of the pumpkin. And so if I rotate around the center of the pumpkin, the eyes will either move down or move up, which is not what we want unless you want really disturbed looking pumpkins. I need to move the coordinate system or the center of the coordinate system to the location of the eye and then rotate around that point for each one. So let's do that. So there's my translation to where I want the eye to rotate around, and then I can rotate by that angle, and then I'm just going to make a triangle. And you can see the top of the triangle is at that rotation point at the origin of my newly translated coordinate system. And then I just have the left and the right, which are below that. So 1 point to the left, -7, and 1 to the right, +7. And you can play with those numbers if you want larger or smaller eyes, or you could turn these into parameters that are also randomly set at the beginning. And so different pumpkins would have different eye sizes. One of the things you'll notice is that as we do procedural generation, you end up having lots and lots of parameters for every little piece of whatever you're generating. And now we can pop this matrix. So this just draws the left eye. If I want to draw the right eye, I can simply copy this code. But now I want to translate to the right to draw the right eye. So I'll put in a +20 and I want to rotate by the opposite amount. So the eyes either rotate both in or both out. So there we go. Let's give this a shot. So there, my jack-o'-lanterns now have eyes, and you can see they're all rotated at different angles. So we get some nice variety out of them. And now for the mouth, I'll do something similar. I want a separate function. And now for the mouth, because I want to do a rescaling, I do need to do another push and pop matrix, but I don't have to do a translate because I want the mouth just a little below the center of the pumpkin. So I again push on a matrix. In this case, I don't do a translate, I just do a scale. And then I'm going to draw the mouth as an arc. And here's how arcs work in processing. The first two numbers are the XY location of the center of the mouth. So 0 is the X position. So that's going to put it at the center of the pumpkin. And then 4 is just going to shift it down ever so slightly, really just 4 pixels. So that's where the center of the arc is. 70 is the width of the arc. So I'm going to get a nice wide arc that fills most of the pumpkin. 20 is sort of the height of the arc. So it just comes down a little bit on the face. And then these two values are the angles. So I'm going to go from 0 to pi. And I'll start by just doing this piece. And because I'm calling this after draw eyes, it's going to use the same fill color that the eyes used, which is 0. But it's probably a little better programming practice to explicitly set the fill color to 0 here. And so there we go. There's my mouths. And the only thing that I don't entirely like about them is the line at the top is flat. And if you're fine with that, great, use it. But I'll put in another arc in the same hue as the pumpkin itself in order to make it look a little more curved. So for that, all I need to do is fill with the original hue and then put in a new arc. And this arc is 1 pixel higher, and that's to avoid getting a little black line across the top. It's the same width, but it's in a sense, a shallower arc. And so it's only going to cut sort of the top of the mouth off. And it's the same 0 to pi. And again, all of these numbers you could turn into parameters and randomize them to get even more variety in your mouth shapes. So there we go. Now we have a bunch of smiling jack-o'-lanterns. Thank you and have fun.